Welcome to Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. And I'm Lorriann Clements. I'm a feminist writer, facilitator, activist and coach, and the initiator of Healing Solidarity. In this conversation, I talk with Lorriann Robinson about her work on a careers fair to promote the careers of Black and other marginalised groups in development spaces, and about how she thinks we should promote and support diversity, inclusion and equity in our work. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Lorriann as much as I enjoyed having it. Enjoy. So hi and welcome back to Healing Solidarity, and I'm here with Lorriann Robinson, and I'm actually going to ask Lorriann to tell us a bit about herself and what she does, because I love to hear people's own description of their work and their person.
Sure. So I'm Lorriann Robinson, and last year I set up a new consultancy organization called the Advocacy Team. Mm-hmm. And it's called the Advocacy Team because that's really my background and most of what we do. So we help international organizations with their campaigns, and particularly their advocacy campaigns. But there's another side to the advocacy team where we want to challenge the development sector and to promote equity within development. And I'm particularly focusing on race and representation in development. So within our first year, we've already started a whole train of work around diversity and development. And I'm sure I'll say more about that as we go through.
Yeah,
but that's really what we're doing. Those are the two sides of the advocacy team.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you. I think I wanted to start by just asking you about your own experience of being a Black woman working in the sector in the UK, but in development generally too. Like, what's your experience been, and maybe how does that inform some of the things you're doing? And we'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. But
Sure. So I would say my experience has been largely positive. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason that I'm doing this work to try to encourage more people from minority backgrounds to get into development is because I think development has a lot to offer as a career route and as a career as a career to go down. And I think we forget that when we're in it, just the privilege that it is to work in development, to be able to work on missions and causes that speak to you and that means something, that allows you to feel. You don't always feel like you're making an impact, but there are definitely the times when you do. And my career has taken me to parts of the world that I never ever imagined that I would go to, and places that I never imagined I would see, and meet people I never imagined that I would meet. And I think it's just I can always remember I once took a group of a cohort of some of the youngest British MPs to see development programs in Kenya. Mm-hmm. And I was part of the advance group that went out before the MPs to make sure everything was in place and to meet everyone that they were going to meet on the trip. So it was really polished before when they got there. And the Saturday before they arrived, I was out with my local team in Kenya, and they were asking me what snacks we should have in the car for the MPs. And I remember thinking, when I was growing up, nobody told me these jobs existed. Nobody told me these opportunities were there, that these opportunities existed. And so I don't want to paint a rose-tinted picture of development, because of course we know that it has its challenges, but overall I think that my experience has been largely positive, and that's why I've been motivated to try to open up these opportunities to a wider group of people.
Yeah, right. Let's talk a bit about that, because I know about the careers fair, and I'd love to hear more about that and where the idea came from, and then the other things that you're working on as the advocacy team in terms of diversity and opening things up.
Yeah. So the careers fair came about as what I thought was an obvious small thing that I was well placed. I thought I was well placed to do. And so on the one hand, I had sometimes even just on the train, people may have spotted my profile on LinkedIn, or people would come up to me and if they knew what I did and they knew about my job, they would always ask me how they could get into development. And I had a few conversations with particularly a group of women that I couldn't understand how they couldn't get in, because their CVs, it felt to me like they had done everything that they that you could possibly ask somebody trying to get into the sector, that they had gone well above and beyond. So I couldn't understand why they couldn't get in. And so, on the other side, because of the work that I'd done, I'd formerly worked as head of advocacy for a bleeding NGO, and I'd worked in the sector for 5 years, and I had a good network among the leadership in some cases, and directors. So I thought I was well placed to just bring those two groups together.
Yeah.
And so in my head, I thought, oh, it's really easy. I'll write a concept note. I'll send it out, and everyone will just say yes, and they'll come, and we'll put on this career fair. And of course, it was not that simple, and it took quite a lot of advocacy and persistence to get there and to make it work. But we did, and it achieved what I wanted it to. So we had over 70 people there on the day in terms of participants, and we had a really great range of employers. And that's going back to what I said about being in Kenya and just recognizing that nobody told me that these kinds of opportunities existed. Right. I wanted to showcase just the breadth of opportunities in development. So we had development finance banks, as well as traditional NGOs, as well as multilaterals, etc. And I think it did what I wanted it to do. Was, on the one hand, it was a space where people could talk about the challenges around race and representation in development. Difid spoke, and one of the first questions to him was, how do you make sure you're not exporting colonialism? And I was like, okay, we're going for it. And so there was definitely that space for people to just talk about, microaggressions and how you navigate different situations, to hear from other people who largely came from minority backgrounds who had done the same, whilst at the same time being really practical and jobs focused. And we've already have at least one person who has secured a role with an employer she connected with at the careers fair.
So I don't think we said, but it was specifically a careers fair for underrepresented groups. I can't remember the phrase you used.
Exactly. Yeah.
Underrepresented. Yeah. So you were specifically trying to open up space, which I think is amazing. I'm interested in what's come out of it going forward, having had that kind of the more difficulty in setting it up maybe than you'd initially imagined.
So what's next? I hope so. The first careers fair was broad, and so the obvious next step is to do something smaller and more focused with that looks at some of the specific career paths in development.
Right.
So I do some smaller sessions looking at careers in policy and research, careers in programs, and careers in advocacy and campaigning. And those are I don't know programs well. I know policy and research well. I know advocacy and campaigning well. So I'm kind of staying within my strengths, although so I'd like to do those in the autumn. But beyond that, we want to do more training, more conferences, more learning. I think there's a huge amount. The irony, I think, with the development sector is that it's so far behind others. So this issue around diversity within our sector is something that almost every sector that is working in public life is struggling with, and has been dealing with. I think that for whatever reason, we have never been under the microscope. And so we have been able to slip under the radar and to do very little. But I think that there are many other sectors, including some of the financial services, that are ahead of us in terms of positive initiatives and positive actions. And so I'd like to do a conference early next year that's focused on learning and focused on drawing out some of those things.
Interesting. And would that be a conference for people who are interested in jobs, or mostly for in people in the sector?
It's both. So I definitely don't want to do a conference which is just knowing that the leadership of the development and the HR teams are largely look like the establishment. I wouldn't want to. I think there's principles of openness and diversity has to flow throughout all of our initiatives. Yeah. And so it has to be both, and it has to be framed around it.
Yeah, okay. And I'm interested in, are people asking you, are you coming to you with their challenges or questions about how to kind of address some of this stuff? Yeah,
absolutely. So I've definitely, and sometimes I don't necessarily feel well placed to do it but there are ways around it. So people will often come to me and say, will you look at my CV? And of course, I'm not a HR person. So I can give you a perspective on your CV, but actually one really nice thing is that I'm connecting with HR teams. Let me call like UNICEF, who are doing something next week where they're allowing me to bring 6 people who came to the careers fair to do a 2-hour careers clinic with UNICEF's HR teams. And so to get that advice from the HR professionals who are giving them those jobs. So there are ways around it. So people are definitely coming to me. But even before people prepare for interviews, they'll come and ask for my advice. Or after an interview, if somebody didn't get a job, they'll ask for my advice. Sometimes INGOs are sending them to me, which I think is interesting given the balance of resources.
Right, absolutely.
But I'll always do my best.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a bit about organizations, because it seems to me like the nub of the problem is with how organizations are approaching some of these the more difficult issues around diversity, and why it is in the sector that we do have like a pretty poor record, particularly in terms of ethnic diversity and kind of the way racism seems to show up in who we're hiring and why we're hiring them and the ways we're making those decisions. So I guess I'm interested in the kind of broader question of, how do you think organizations need to change in terms of how they're approaching diversity?
Yeah. Well, I think that they need to start by just doing stuff. So I think that there are many organizations, I think almost every development organizations I've talked to have said that they are genuinely committed. This is an absolute priority. They really want this. They want their staff to be different at every level.
Yeah.
And I think in some cases they've paid for the consultants to come in and analyze the problem and to write them a strategy. And I think that many of them are stuck there. And so,
interesting.
I think, because that's the hard part. And I think a lot of them would like a quick fix solution, which of course don't exist. And so what I'm trying to do with the advocacy team is to say, like, this is a big problem, but here are some steps that you can take, like to kind of say, here's something that you can do, like get behind this and support this. So yeah, I think that's generally where they are, and I think it's going to take a lot more, I guess, leadership. And commitment, and maybe some external pressure. And I think, to kind of force that change, because at the moment it's one of those things where it's not something that people are necessarily judged on in their KPIs. It's not going to come up in your annual review. It's not like one of the bottom line issues, like how much money did you raise this year, or how many campaigns did you win. So I think that it's just allowed to kind of simmer in the background. And it's going to take quite a lot of leadership, and maybe just calling people out and to say, I think anyone that has just given the origins of our sector, given the nature of the work that we do, the global footprint, the people who are the people our work impacts the most. I think it's hugely problematic if you have an entirely white leadership, and I think that anyone who does should really be asking themselves and really asking themselves why, and be committing to for that to be different. And but I don't think that external pressure to do that, I don't think enough people are even saying that.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm thinking of your kind of advocacy background, and you're definitely much smarter at advocacy than me. Because I think I totally agree with that. And I wonder what might be the levers to put that pressure on, if we did think about it from that kind of campaigning point of view. Like, I was thinking when you said KPIs, like, maybe there's something about that kind of pressure on how people are delivering, and that actually being an indicator. Are there other things you've thought of? I don't know.
So, and this is some of the stuff that I want the conference to look at. So, for example, if you take the BBC, they have legal targets for on-screen and off-screen representation for women and for minorities, and they report to the select committees about that. So, for example, we have a select committee in Parliament that assesses the development sector, that was active in the safeguarding issue. I think it would be really good leadership for the International Development Committee to look at race and diversity and representation in international NGOs. And I guarantee you, every INGO would be doing something to make sure that they come out.
If they came under that scrutiny.
Under that scrutiny. So that, I mean, that is, and that's exactly the kind of pressure the kind of learning, and also the kind of pressure that I think that I'm hoping the conference can draw at.
Yeah. And yeah, I wanted to also broaden it out and think about development in different parts of the world, and like how these issues show up. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that, but we also have this issue of very white organisations in the global north that then are working with staff teams that are much less white or not white at all in other parts of the world, and then with partner organisations that might not be. And like I think that's where we see this kind of what looks like a very colonial kind of throwback thing going, or part of where we see it going on. And I wonder if, like, beyond the kind of diversity in terms of targets and numbers of people, which feels really important, is there more you want to say about how that shows up in the ways we work with people in different places? And I don't know. It's a big question.
I think it is a big question, and that side of it is not my expertise,
right?
But I would say that part of the reason that I think that we need to have more diversity in headquarters, if you like, in headquarters, is partly because it's just an issue of justice. It's about a justice and a kind of good society, and for people to have a fair chance to succeed and to progress, but also because of the perspectives that I would hope that those people would bring. And I was thinking about this morning, because it is definitely the case that not every Black or Asian person working, just like not every woman wants to talk about their experience of being a woman in the workplace. There are many who don't. But I would say very few of those would go and work for a feminist organization. So that's our filter. So where you have people with their origins in the global south working in development, that is already a filter, and already a really strong indicator that this is something that about their identity that they connect to the work. And it's partly because of the perspectives that I hope that those people would bring, and the way that it would challenge our sector to be and to do things differently. One of the more obvious examples is if you think about the way NGOs represent the people, the people who are on the receiving end of their work, and the representation of Africa and the representation of Black people. And that is the representation that affects us, and that affects, regardless of the color of our passports, or regardless of our education or our wealth, it affects how we see ourselves, and it affects how we're seen by others. And I think that when more of us are the directors of finance and directors of comms, it's definitely my hope that those things will be challenged, because they'll see and they'll make the case beyond the bottom line about that wider impact. And I think, I would hope that it would apply, a little bit further on to the kind of practices that you're talking about. I mean, I've seen a situation where with a country CEO who couldn't speak the local language, and so he had like 6 women sitting around him translating on a Monday morning. Just nonsense, right?
Right.
It's a nonsense. And the power dynamics in that setting was such that the staff didn't feel able to say it. I did because I was just breezing in and breezing. So I felt more able to challenge. So I would definitely hope that changing the way HQ looks would have a knock-on effect in terms of some of those power relations.
Right. And actually language is a really important conversation that we don't have enough, I think. Like if we're not able to speak the language of the people that we're working with, and then that's it's a problematic. And obviously there are things you can do with translation, but they don't solve all the problem. Especially Yeah, especially when power's involved too.
Yeah. Well, I think that if you don't speak the language, I'm sure there are other ways that you can contribute to the work of that national team.
Yeah.
But being CEO is probably not one of them.
Yeah, so it's not the ideal role. And it makes me think about what you said earlier about people whose CVs looked at you like they were a fit and they weren't being a fit. And I wonder if some of that is about what I imagine about what we're valuing. For example, I think we're not valuing language enough, right? Mm-hmm. And I wonder what else maybe we're not valuing, or you've seen people not valuing enough, mm-hmm. and the things maybe we're valuing too much, right, as well. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because often, as if you go back to the KPIs by which often development organizations are measuring themselves, I feel like it gets very technical very quickly. So for example, people will really put a lot of thought into how they can tweak their log frame in this way, because this will have an impact on the intervention in a slightly different way. And I think that we value, the sector values that kind of technocratic solutions to what are really social and political problems. So I would say that we value the kind of technocratic, important as that is, over that social and that political and historical awareness, and just knowing that understanding of a context and knowing how things work and knowing how things move and play within a given locality. And I think you can tweak your log frame as much as you want, but you put that together with the people. So right.
And it's kind of those maybe relational things as well, right? And
because even work on gender, you're talking about things that are fundamentally political, and I think that's too often the politics is taken out of development when it's fundamentally a political exercise.
Absolutely agree. Given that we've agreed that it's a fundamentally political exercise, let's talk about the future, like with the work you're doing, with work that obviously other people are doing. Mm-hmm. What are your hopes for the kind of future of the sector? Like, and behind that is the question, like, should we, is development really the right thing to be doing? And if it is, what could a better future for it look like,
So my hopes would be that I hoped that the safeguarding crisis, difficult as that was, that would have prompted a period of just openness and introspection and collective thinking about development and the way forward. And I think that, and I don't think it has done that. I don't think the leadership in development has taken that opportunity. And so it's definitely still my hope that happens, but I think we might need to it's definitely still my hope that happens. But I think that again, I was thinking about this recently, that when you think about the origins of development, which was always about interventions that were doing a level of good, but within the context of deeply exploitative systems and abusive systems. And I think every single person working in development needs to ask themselves whether that's what they're doing, whether your intervention is still trying to do an element of good but not within an exploitative and abusive system, or whether your interventions are trying to change those exploitative and abusive systems, or maybe you're trying to do both. But where do you sit within that paradigm? Because I don't think that we should be comfortable and okay with just the former. We just kind of tinkering. And the other challenge I would make to development, and it's something that the writer Akala talks about a lot, is and this has always been the origins of development, is that it became, I read something recently where a really high percentage of the British population think that empire was a good thing. And why did they think empire was a good thing? Was because they'll say because we built roads and we built hospitals and we brought God. So development and so development was the cover for this exploitation. And I don't think we should ever allow our sector, that we to be that cover. And again, I think I want us to see more space for more openness. And I think if we start the conversations with those issues in mind, I think it would really frame how we talk about development and how we change things. And having said that, as I said, I worked previously as the head of UK advocacy. So a lot of my job was really trying to persuade politicians to continue investing money, to continue to keep the 0.7 budget. I know the people who are still doing those jobs are working really hard now with a new government. So I understand the political reality of what it requires to persuade governments in Western countries to continue giving small amounts of money that they do give. And that job is hard enough. But if you ask me what's my hope is that we wouldn't have to do that. That sense of just responsibility, that it was not always on that the 0.7 was not always on the line, that it was not something that we had to beg for, that it was Western governments and leaders just really accepted it as a responsibility, as a responsibility, and we wouldn't have to waste so much time and effort and resources in trying to massage their egos and in order to keep this going. Exactly.
Thinking about what you just said about colonial history and development being the kind of the cover for basically, you said exploitation, I'd say murder and all kinds of other things, right? And theft and a lot more. I'm wondering whether that I feel like when we're arguing, say, for 0.7 in this context, it's almost like we've rubbed out that colonial history or something. It's almost like we've let it kind of just be well, now we're just doing the good bit, that bit's done or something. There's some kind of narrative like that, certainly I think in kind of British society, and that it's deeply shocking that so many people think that empire was a good thing. And I almost feel like we have to understand on some level, certainly within the sector, and maybe far beyond it, that empire was an evil, awful, abhorrent thing, in order for us to understand that actually this commitment to 0.7 is not just a nice thing to do for some poor people somewhere else, but a consequence of the inequity in the world caused by a history of colonialism and patriarchy and capitalism and all of that, but deeply in the UK by a colonial history. I don't know what you think about that, but I've been thinking a lot about that. Actually, it feels like that political thing has to come into the politics of it on some level.
Yeah, and I think you almost need to separate that public education from development. And I'm very conscious. Yeah. I'm very conscious of the political reality of where we are politically at this moment in 2019, as we're approaching Brexit, as we are approaching, that. Speaking about this society particularly, I don't think that kind of argument will be well received.
Right, no, I hear you.
In fact, it would be bad. And I think it's part of us and the need for people who agree, who spend our time talking to each other, and we reinforce our agreement. And I think that we're right. There's no question in my mind that we're right. But I feel like there's a challenge to be made. And I'm not saying we should make it palatable, but I almost feel we need to separate it from the work of development, that it should be a kind of education-led public education about the history of this country and the history of empire and the history of colonialism and slavery and all of those things, and because of course so much for the UK so much of it did not happen here, that public understanding and that narrative is needed, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting you say separate it from development. Because I guess the obvious risk in this political moment is that by having the political education piece collapses development funding even more, right? And then you don't have any resource with which to build different kinds of solidarity that are meaningful and useful. And
public support for development is already not great. And so we're in a situation where the political support for development, the support in Parliament is good. But of course, politicians look to their constituents, and a lot of them are getting a hard time, and they're getting mailbags that don't like point 7 and don't like what we're doing. So I think that that fight to keep point 7 is real. It's that, it's 14 billion pounds in development assistance a year, and because I've done the job, I don't underestimate the fact that it's needed. But yeah, I think separating those two things out might well be a way around it. Yeah.
And a final question, maybe. In your work, that separation, because I'm thinking it's a really interesting line of making sure that we do have the politics in the development, but separating the messaging where we need to. And it's all about being pragmatic. And I feel like your work with the Careers Fair is really pragmatic as well in that sense. And I really want to honour that. And the way that you're doing that with, just like, we're going to like positive actions, right? Because it's really easy. And that's one thing about this conference that I really wanted to speak to. It's like, it's not really easy, but it can be easy to critique. And it's often a lot harder to make change happen. And so I guess a final question to you would be like, what else do you see might need to happen from your perspective, or what else do you want to do? What final thoughts do you have to share?
So I think that the advocacy team is still a really young organization. I have huge ambitions for what we might do. Again, like building on the learning of other sectors, I would love if we can fundraise for it. I would love to have to develop programs that directly support cohorts of talented people to prepare to compete for some of the best graduate positions in NGOs, and also a kind of step up to leadership positions. So to be really active in that, because I think leadership is where this will happen. This change will really come. I think it's not that difficult actually to bring in more minorities into entry level and slightly above that positions. I think that will happen, and some of that's happening now. But it's really changing the face of the leadership. So I would love to fundraise to develop a program that directly supports cohorts of minorities and women from underrepresented groups to really step into leadership positions across the sector. And that's something I'd like to do in the next 12 to 18 months.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lorriann. I really appreciate the time you've taken.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you. All right, take care.
You too. Bye-bye. You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Lorriann Robinson. And this is Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. If you'd like to spend a little more time with the ideas and suggestions we discussed in this talk, or in any of the others in this conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of the conference and get access to recordings and resources to help you go deeper with these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more.